what were my top 10 books that I read in 2022? I've read quite a lot of, and this is just fiction. I read a lot of fiction. I don't know the exact count, but it's over a book a week, I think, average. So it must be 60 or 70 or something. And read a lot of interesting stuff. I read only a few weak books. I don't think I've read any books I thought I hate this book. But I read a lot of good books too, and so there was an interesting issue of working out what top 10 was, especially when I was reading some things within series. I read, and I'll give some on mentions without, not got the books, but I will give some honourable mentions. I wasn't sure, but I'll say a few things which I thought were interesting. I picked 10 books or series, where it's a series, I think, unless I really thought there was one that stood out above all the rest. I'm just going to show all of them so that I'm not taking up 5 slots or something. And in some cases it's difficult, it's complex to know what the series is or what the books are. That is, there are 6 sci-fi or fantasy novels, 2 mysteries, 3 mysteries I guess actually, and 1 fantasy graphic novel, fantasy/sci-fi graphic novel, and I wondered whether to include the graphic novel, because it is fiction, but it's something I wouldn't normally include. I wouldn't think of it, but it was one of the best books I read all year, and it represents to some degree how much of the stuff I read was also graphic novels. If you add in graphic novels, probably I was 70 or 80 fiction books in the year. So the honourable mention I'll give, let's say it's this. I'm not sure if I'd put anything else as high as an honourable mention. Were some other very good books. Do you know what? I'm just going to cheat right here, right now, because I'm looking at my computer. Just see if there's anything else that strikes me before I give what I think will be my honourable mention. Honourable mention. There's a couple of stories I still need to finish. I really enjoyed getting into H.P. Lovecraft, reading nearly all of his works this year. Very much enjoyed that. Enjoyed C.J. Cherryh's Faded Sun. At points it got to being very, very good. I read a lot of Elric by Michael Moorcock, and I have a lot of issues with Moorcock, but at its very best that was also an interesting experience. The Warden by Anthony Trollope was very good. Abraham Merritt's sci-fi, his early sci-fi, very important in both weird fiction and sci-fi circles. I enjoyed a lot. The Bromeliad trilogy by Terry Pratchett I enjoyed a lot. So that's a sample of what I read and enjoyed. I also finished, I think, Last Argument of Kings from the First Law trilogy I read this year. I have a lot of good things to say about the First Law trilogy. So there's a bunch of books I read really good. The main honourable mention I will go for, though, is Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy. Despite, if you watch my reviews, having some significant criticisms of Hobb, based particularly around bloatedness and repetition and inability to, because if you're forming your plot around the characters, the plot still has to work. You don't have an excuse because it's a character book, and so I had issues there. But the actual achievement of the books is still very, very, it's superlative. It's still very, very good. It still has so much going for it as a series, and I'm going to be starting Ship of Magic next week. Next week probably, but next year, early next year, and reading the Life Ship Traders trilogy hopefully through the year. So I've obviously liked it enough to continue. I think given that I read 4 Wheel of Time books and was pretty exhausted by that and bounced off. I don't like all epic fantasy. I have patience for it, but I feel different with Hobb. I feel a lot more positive and I like the world a lot. So with caveats, that was my honourable mention. My number 10, I'll go straight for the graphic novel. It wasn't necessarily my 10th best of the year. It might have been higher. This is roughly ordered, this, but it's because it's the graphic novel. We'll get it out of the way early. Astro City Metro Book 1 by Kurt Busiek and others, Brent Jansen, Alex Ross, particularly. And this is a mid to late 90s, this particular set of comics. Astro City Volume 1, 1 to 6, and Volume 2, 1 to 12, plus Wizard Presents Astro City 1/2. I think it's maybe through to the early noughties actually, but from 96, 95, 96, 97 are the copyright dates. So yeah, through to the late 90s. The run of his superhero comic which is essentially attempting to distill down superhero mythology in a approachable, easy format, written for adults to a degree, but accessible to at least young adults as well, and looking for the archetypes but giving them spins. So, and I thought a really interesting review I read of this is, and this doesn't, I don't comment on the comic or the more famous TV series that this refers to, but someone was asking, and I saw a few posts like this, but this one was about The Boys, saying I read The Boys, didn't like its cynicism or nihilism. What, is Astro City going to be good or is it going to be bad? And actually a response was that it was the antidote to that. It was not cynical, it was not nihilistic. It believed in the superhero mythos, the grand mythos. It understood why people find it appealing. It didn't go for easy, cheap tricks. In fact, there's some things which are quite complex. It also didn't go for tired tropes, like, oh, well, it's just this. The superheroes are new. There's what would a Superman figure actually do if they saw their power and their duty as the centre of their life? Really, also some really interesting presentations of characters' backgrounds and ideas, which weren't common at the time and aren't common now. As I'm much more interested in why people do things than plenty of superhero comics and books are. So yeah, Astro City Metro Book 1. The art is also generally very pleasant without being, it's very good, I should say. It's not, it's very, very good and competent in the style of the time. Actually quite fresh for the style of the time. I guess you could caveat it slightly that it's not, it's not groundbreaking, but then it doesn't have to be. It is very good. I did read some other very good graphic novels this year. I did some rereads of a bunch of stuff, some of Scott Snyder's Batman run, a bunch of Sandman graphic novels, which I am counting rereads to some degree. They could qualify for top 10. And I got into Saga a bit, read 3 volumes of that, really enjoyed Saga in lots of ways, without it blowing me away in the way it obviously blows away some people. But yeah, that was my graphic novel for the year. Number 9, and one of 3 mysteries in the list, After the Funeral by Agatha Christie. This is a Poirot. It is a post-war Poirot, and it's more apparent, I think. Agatha Christie was an observer of social life, as much as she was a plot creator for mysteries. Very observant of human beings, very interested in human affairs. And After the Funeral is post-war, and there's a big thing going on, I think, and this can't be an original thought at all. I'm sure this has been written on vastly extensively. It's not just that she's constantly writing about the new situation that she sees before her. It's also that there is a shift in her pre-war and post-war novels, that her pre-war novels, particularly the Poirot pre-war novels, and to some degree some of the others, are much more adventure stories at points. They have a bit more daring do, not always, but a bit more daring do. They are a lot lighter and jazzier, even as they have very dark elements to them. They partly, this comes out because of the fact that you're using the country house tropes and things like that. The upper middle class, the country upper middle class, the urban upper class, and they're both and there's a Fitzgeraldian thing there as well. The brightness and the darkness. Post-war, you get a bit more of what might be sometimes called social realism. She's always socially realist, but it might be considered more like, people in very different circumstances, the changing world. And there's a slightly more somber and pensive tone at points, I think. But yeah, After the Funeral is it just at the end of the war, possibly? No, published 53. But this is the blurb. There are certain things that are best left unsaid. Though tragedy had touched the life of the wealthy Richard Abernathy, his sudden death seemed pretty unremarkable for a man of his age, so why would his sister wait until his funeral to say he had been murdered? And then basically things spin out of control, and they turn to Poirot, and it's an inheritance plot. But it's an inheritance plot and a country house plot of the post-war mode for Christie. And of several Christie mysteries I read this year, some for the first time, some repeat, this was my favourite, and I think has a bunch of plot solutions that, so as ever, there are bits that you can guess beforehand, there are bits that you can't, that are impossible to really get a grip on unless you're incredibly good at organising all the information in your head. And I think it's a really good example of a Christie plot with a really quite deep and textured world, and I enjoyed it greatly, and I think it's one of my favourite post-wars. There are a couple of the very good post-wars. Number 8, also a mystery. Pandora by Holly Hollander by Gene Wolfe. There is a mystery, you can follow it. You can presumably get it right or wrong. It's a Nancy Drew mystery, is the stylings. It's about a teenage girl in Chicago, and there is a murder at an antiques fair, the annual antiques fair that her family or her mother takes part in running, and she falls in with the, typically in Wolfian terms, wounded in the leg hero, Aladdin Blue, the private detective. And there's a bunch of different layers and things that you could interpret going on. It appears in many ways to be one of Wolfe's simpler novels, and it's right for people to say, oh, that's a mistake to think that it's simple. But it's certainly very easy reading, and it's an incredibly good pastiche of the subgenre of mystery. I think there's an interesting thing that I certainly ran into, probably the hottest disagreement in Wolfe discussion that I've had over what I actually think the mystery is, what the real stuff going on in the book is, and what I think of the plot relating to the murder mystery. And I won't spoil more there, other than to say that, I think the red herrings are not what people think they are, to put it differently. I think there are meta red herrings. It's a very good book. It's easy to read. If you want an introduction to Wolfe, you still need to read quite closely, but you can read easily, and which there are objectives you can apply yourself to in a reasonable way, that kind of in a normal fictive way. This isn't a bad place to start. It's not where I'd say to start for Wolfe, but I think it's in that, with those qualifications, it's a good place to start. Number, I guess, are we at something like 654? I think we're at something like 6, are we? 9, 8, 7, 6, 7, I think. 7. Let's go for this one. These ones, there's a few in the middle here which are pretty close. This I think is probably about 7. I think I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. Might be just more than that in terms of with 0.25s involved. Ellen Kushner, Thomas the Rhymer. I have reviews for most of these books, by the way, of the ones I'm going through. Not After the Funeral, not one that comes later. Not graphic novels generally either, but the rest. This is a medieval Scottish story of Thomas Rhymer, a historical figure who is said to have, in his lifetime, was said to have gone to Fairy and back. And it's a 4-part play, basically. There are 4 parts narrated by one of the 4 main characters. And it's, subtitled a romance. And it is a romance in some ways. It's an exceptionally interesting, enjoyable book. Beautifully written. The structure is very literary. And pulls that off, works that well. The idea that a literary structure and a literary style don't necessarily mean complex in the way that, say, Gene Wolfe is. Gene Wolfe is literary, but there's something else going on really as well. But what I mean is there is a certain willingness to stylistically recreate and reformulate in the structure, and she pulls it off. I think it works well. It's a very nice, pleasant, pretty book. There's also poignant and offbeat and sometimes sad, sometimes funny, sometimes happy. 6, The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, which I read because I was reading stuff about Mars, and I've got into a lot more Bradbury to different degrees in different ways since. I bought a few more Bradburys. I think I'd only read one Bradbury before this, The Illustrated Man. I've now read, reading it slow. I haven't read Fahrenheit 451, but reading very slowly the beautiful Dandelion Summer, and I'll be announcing this probably tomorrow or something. But having a buddy read next year on my Discord with some friends of Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is technically a sequel to Dandelion Summer. Isn't really. Martian Chronicles is a fix-up of short stories and novelettes of man going to Mars, and it has stuff. It has some like mock hard sci-fi points. It's chiefly though it's in the tradition of planetary romance. So John Carter of Mars, and Lee Brackett, and Her Mars, so sort of Rhiannon Say, and C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. Say those books as a good sample of planetary romance. And this, so it's sci-fi, but it's sci-fi at the fantastic end in terms of its vision of space. But because it's Bradbury, it's not. Whereas Kim Stanley Robinson and The Martian both are, so Robinson's Mars trilogy and Andy Weir's The Martian. I read The Martian this year, really enjoyed it. They are hard sci-fi, proper hard sci-fi. They have other things going on in them, but they are like, here's a bunch of real things we currently would believe are the case. And we're modelling how they'd work out, and we're like, how would that work, and how would, if this went wrong, how would you solve it, and how would the politics emerge? Here, some of the same questions are there philosophically, but really it's about how humans can't escape humans. To some degree, some of our best features, but significantly a lot of our worst. At the start of the Cold War, he writes, there's no escape from who we are. We have to fix it in some way. There's something else that has to happen to work this out. And there are thinly veiled allegories in that of American expansion into its own West, and Cold War politics and individual human evil and the things that tempt us and the things that we value, including good things. And so it's Bradbury. He has a strongly poignant and not downbeat maybe, but not downbeat in the way that we think of now. Grim, darky stuff, but just a propensity to that. But I think he's a beautiful writer. He's a beautiful imaginer, stylistically and imaginatively. He's one of our best. And yeah, this was a great reintroduction to him for me. 5, I think we're on. Paul Anderson, The Broken Sword, and inspire. This is part of my thing about Moorcock. It's like, man, this is great. And you think if you'd read Turin Turambar, you'd have realised that Tolkien also did the same stuff. But Paul Anderson, The Broken Sword, is, if you have heard that Elric is good, I'd just say go and read this first, because it's better. This is a very good book. It's very sad, epic, and gritty Norse saga type. The sword Turfing has been broken by Thor to prevent it striking at the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree, but now the mighty sword is needed again to save the elves, who are heavily besieged in their war against the trolls. Only Skafloc, a human child kidnapped and raised by the elves, can hope to persuade the mighty ice giant Baldverk to make the shattered blade whole again. But first, Skafloc must also confront Valgard the Changeling, his shadow self, who took his place in the world of men. So yes, the bank reviews are from Moorcock and Holdstock, so if you want some big names backing this, and I think it has, who's the intro by? Is it anyone? Michael Derder, so there we are, someone significant. But yes, it's Anderson at his best. It's emotive, it's beautifully written, has great action scenes, great imaginings. It is, for a short-ish book, a short book in fact, I'd say, 250 pages, 230 pages indeed. It gets an enormous amount in, and it's, in terms of Anderson, though he definitely also bleeds into what you might call the new wave, he's also at the back end of pulp. He has pulpish habits, in the same way that Vance does, a contemporary, and they have a similarly long writing careers. Bradbury too, though Bradbury maybe more explicitly new wave, more experimental, more lateral. Anderson, like Vance, fairly direct in lots of ways, very big into the kind of in the imaginative put together of the worlds he's making. He has the advantage that he has a strong poetic bent, and he's structurally good at putting all those things in, rather than it feeling kind of crunched together. They all fit, and you kind of want more space for them, but not because it's not working. So yeah, Broken Sword. I think I said that was 5. 4, I think I put this here. Some of these I don't remember all my ratings, and obviously to some degree it's only an approximation. I read 2 parts of the LA Quartet this year by James Ellroy. I watched the 3rd part, LA Confidential, the film thereof, and it's my film of the year, I think. Probably one of my 10 best favourite films ever. And I thought, okay, it's based on a book, okay. I did see there's an okay adaptation of The Black Dahlia. Haven't watched it. But I read Black Dahlia and The Big Nowhere. And of the 2, which are both very good, in quality in lots of ways similar, the very slight weaknesses in each are slightly different to each other, though somewhat similar. The strengths are slightly different to each other, but somewhat similar. Basically, so I think I'd say The Black Dahlia was probably my preferred of the 2. What I'd say is that Ellroy is a masterful writer in basically every respect, and these are quite dark, difficult, bloody stories. They're not always for weak-stomached people. They are mysteries, murder mysteries, indeed. Both of those are murder mysteries, and they have mystery elements. There are things where you can and should try to follow along and work out what's happened. Sometimes he's not always successful at getting all those elements across. Sometimes, and these were not his first novels, but fairly early, and in lots of ways this is seen to be where he really launches off into becoming a writer who gets hardback Everyman library collections. But he's good at that. He's stylistically effective, and he's very good at voice. The first book is first person, the second book is not, it's third person, but he gets this diction of the hard-boiled noir novels really right. So out of tragedy a love story has begun, but where will it end? K-Lake says, the important things now are my education in Lee. Happy days are here again. And with Big Lee Blanchard on Kay's case, it looks like they're here to stay. That is, in fact, that's a quote from a newspaper, but you can hear the voice, can't you? And that's the voice where that's the of all things I think of Avatar: The Legend of Korra announcer. I think because I saw Avatar advert yesterday, but the tone of the narrator, whether first person or third person, is much more like Marlowe, Philip Marlowe in the Chandler novels, things like that. So yeah, Black Dahlia, I think, is my my 4th best of the year or thereabouts. Third best, I'd say. Also, I think about Ellroy is they're bloody, they're difficult, they're worrying, anxiety-inducing, but they are also not inhumane. They are not nihilistic. They are not cynical. It is something. I mean, you can maybe go back and forth in this in Cormac McCarthy and what some people say about the Border trilogy, for instance. I actually have one. I need to read one of his. I need to read one of his westerns. There, Blood Meridian. But The Road is difficult but redemptive, and I think there is a redemptive streak in Ellroy, a quite real redemptive streak, I think, which doesn't mean there's all happy endings or everything's easy, but it means something. This Ellroy's own words are, I tell redemptive tales aimed at women. He urges, love God, fear God, seek goodness as dark forces assail you. As Tom Nolan comments, words to live by and to write by. These are not nihilistic, and that's important. Another not nihilistic book is A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller, the classic novel of a dark future age. 3 novellas. Is it his only book published in his lifetime, or maybe at least this is his only solo novel published in his lifetime? The sequel to this, his only other novel, I think, was finished by someone else with his permission, his instruction. He wrote short stories, but basically from the very early 60s, Morris disappeared off the scene for 35 years. But yeah, this is 3 novellas connected over hundreds of years, they're set at different times, about the Order of St. Leibowitz, which is an order dedicated to preserving knowledge after a nuclear holocaust. The atomic flame deluge was over. The earth was dead, all knowledge was gone. In a hellish barren desert, a humble monk unearths a fragile link to a 20th century civilization. A handwritten document from the Blessed St. Leibowitz that reads, pound pastrami, canned kraut, 6 bagels, bring home for Emma. Could this holiness of relics hold the key to humanity's salvation? Though there is a comic streak that is not representative of what the book is like, it's not sort of like these idiots pick up rubbish knowledge. They're genuinely attempting to build civilization. And you see how that happens in Atomic Scarred America. It has its own concerns and worries about humanity that echo James Ellroy or Ray Bradbury, but it has a view of the sacred flame of civilization, and it takes a view on how to preserve it. It gives different views, though. There's debate in the books. It's really interesting that it's very effective at doing that. I think one thing you could say, what the comparison a friend of mine made on it when discussing books on my Discord. In fact, Parameter, one of my subs, she said that it reminded her of reading It of the Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, and there's a similar thing of monks preserving knowledge and being interested in building up knowledge. But I think the conclusions the two authors come to about what that is and how it happens are very different. They're both beautiful novels, but they're very different. So, yeah, I recommend that. Number 2 for the year. Technically, all of these are rereads, but I'm giving them in here. One, because I think, at least with one, I think I hadn't had a reread for a very long time. I need to check my reading record. But the other, but also I think that it was a very special experience. I will have read, basically it's Middle-earth. Lord of the Rings I read in the summer, reread for the 4th time I think. Silmarillion I finished today, in fact in our Slow Burn buddy read group, and I think that's might be my second reread. I don't think it's my first. I think I have read it all the way through twice. I've read bits and pieces several more times than that. But my third read, and this I will do a review, but this has aged in my own experience very well. And I was going to finish this tonight, in fact, The Hobbit, reading with my kids. I think I'll read it tomorrow night. One of them was asleep, so we left it. This also ages well. This is, I think, my 4th, maybe my 5th read, probably my 4th. So they're heavily reread, but they're all in a sense fresh to me this year, and certainly the comparison and the meeting of them is amazing. I haven't got to Unfinished Tales this year, probably will read it next year, which in a sense is that's the 4th of the great quadrilogy of big Middle-earth books, if you're not including stuff in the fix-up great tales, or some of the unfinished stuff in History of Middle-earth that's kind of interesting to read. The Shadow Returns, or whatever it's called, Return of the Shadow, Tal Almar, which I'm going to talk about soon. Actually, I read both of those fragments this year. They're both incredibly interesting. But yeah, this though it might be a cheat to put in a reread, and especially something so reread, these were some of the most important and interesting and valuable things I read this year, and they may in some terms, certainly Lord of the Rings is, I think, the novel of the 20th century, and so in a sense maybe they should come first, but yeah, they're not. I won't give them first, but they were, with their beauty, with the variety, when you realise, especially that's the thing about reading The Shadow Returns or Return of the Shadow and Tal Almar, is the sheer range Tolkien really had in a way that simply I don't think is appreciated by some people who think of him as doing one thing, but how efficient and beautiful and easy to read this is, how genuinely very enjoyable The Hobbit is, how deep, how thoughtful. It gets sometimes cut down, even by people who like it, as a kid's book, but it deals with some pretty interesting themes about sin and temptation, call them if you like. Very, very good. And the Silmarillion is a better saga than The Broken Sword. It is certainly a better saga than Elric, for all I like bits of Elric. But if you're interested in modern saga form, the Silmarillion, because it's not a novel, it is fiction, but it's not a novel. Bearing that in mind, it is, even with its imperfections from, which, yeah, I'll talk about when I do a review, it's still a straight 5-star with no real caveats to that. There are imperfections, but even with them, it is so superlatively good. at the saga format and efficiently poetically putting together an enormous story spanning hundreds of years with a vast cast of characters in a beautiful and powerful and affecting way, and a meaningful way. That is, one of my that on its own would be a top 10 entry. My top one, though, and this is an echo of last year. I think I need to double check, but I think it's actually the same author. We've already had one of his books, Pandora by Holly Hollander, but we're going to go for Solar Cycle Gene Wolfe books that I've read this year. I read Sword of the Lictor and Citadel of the Autarch, which are parts 3 and 4 of the Book of the New Sun. I read Litany of the Long Sun, which is Sword and Citadel. Litany of the Long Sun is Nightside the Long Sun and Lake of the Long Sun. There's a nice illustration. It's weird, they managed to get the two really good illustrations by this author. One of the illustrations is really unclear and fuzzy, and the other from Nightside looks like it's from a different series despite being the same art style. But really beautiful cover on this one of Silk and Oreb by the Lake. And I also read Epiphany of the Long Sun, which is Chaldea of the Long Sun and Exodus from the Long Sun. Very aggravatingly, despite being all books from the same set of printings or whatever, or very similar, they've got different texture covers. This is the kind of, feels like the cheaper print on demand one, and it has the laminate peel as well, which happens. This does not have that happening, and I'd like to complain to the manager. But yeah, these are brilliant. Just to say about these, this was the complete group of books I read this year by Wolfe, the Book of the Long Sun. I think I rate it a shade below New Sun, probably. I think there are things where in some ways I prefer it, if you ask me a different day I might feel differently. I'm coloured by the fact I'm reading the sequel to Book of the New Sun, Earth of the New Sun, and I'm planning to finish that probably tomorrow. I'd kind of hoped to get it finished by now, but it's very good. I will know what I think about it completely by the end. But I think returning to Severian in this slightly different mode has maybe made me think a lot about the Book of the New Sun. I think, there's a reason why you get so many, Le Guin, Gaiman, Martin, and others praising Wolfe so highly. He is an author's author, sci-fi author or sci-fi fantasy author's author, in the same way, I guess, that Norm Macdonald is a comedian's comedian. He doesn't make himself approachable, partly because he assumes you're clever enough to know how to approach him. His books regularly rely on some form of the unreliable narrator. Do not believe people when they say that Gene Wolfe lies to you. He does not lie to you, I don't think. But you have to trust him, but not any further than you can throw him. He's telling you what's going on, but there's work you have to do to get to the depths of it. And you can often enjoy the beautiful prose and the weird, interesting stuff he's making up. I mean, that's one thing. Book of the New Sun and Book of the Long Sun are both incredibly inventive sci-fis, creating entire worlds. Like, they are secondary realities and speculative fiction of a true form. Wolfe, I wonder, when he writes about the rural Chicago, not of his youth, but of his, of his adult experience, or at least as he looks back at his experience of it, is that not speculative at some level? But at the same time, these are much more easily describable as speculative fiction. They're secondary worlds. They're the far future. They're sci-fi, and they appear like fantasy in Book of the New Sun. He plays some of the same trick in Book of the Long Sun, which is bold, right? To just decide that you're going to do the same thing. His point is actually, I don't think he would not have agreed with the implication of Arthur C. Clarke's point about magic and science looking like each other when sufficiently advanced. But he would have, I think, agreed with some of the practicalities of that the way we understand our world is so coloured by our experience and knowledge of it, that when we describe it, and this is the genius, it will seem alien and strange to those hearing about it who don't share the same predilections. It's cross-cultural, and there's a whole gimmick there in Book of the New Sun from the end of the first of the 4 sub-books. Like Lord of the Rings, it was conceived as one story and written largely together. Somewhat the same with Long Sun too, I think. But though not quite the same. But I think the point is that there's this gimmick where he's translating a book from the future, the Book of the New Sun, and I think that should highlight to us what he thinks he's doing by creating this particular diction, this particular vision of a world that seems medieval but obviously isn't, where people live in spaceships, where they almost don't understand how to describe the amazing wonders they use in ways that we'd understand as amazing, because they're not just incomprehensible, some of them are incomprehensible, but they're also just normal. And I think there are in both stories, Long Sun and New Sun, there is a story of, and I guess the companions to these then matters as a partial response, i.e. Earth for New Sun and Short Sun for Long Sun. But I think they are both stories of technologically advanced societies which have in some way decayed and begin to resemble a medieval or early Renaissance society, and they have characters within them who are sort of set up, I guess, to answer this problem in part, though not necessarily in the way you'd expect or that you'd think would happen in this kind of fantasy. But that's the whole point, is they're actually not fantasy. They have the trappings of medieval fantasy or early Renaissance fantasy, but they are in fact sci-fi. And so the problems are sci-fi problems. But really it's also Woolf, and so a way in which I think Woolf is an undeniably greater writer in this, or at least thinker in this respect, than Bradbury, is that and I think writer is the right word, greater writer, and Bradbury is great, but is that he is able to combine his speculative interests at a high level, that in a crazy way this ends up not being quite the hard sci-fi that you expect, but a form of hard sci-fi masked as something else, and the something else it's being masked as is part of a wider, it's a device that he's using as part of a wider project of trying to ask questions about human nature and about the hero's journey, and that's the obvious one for Severian particularly, and all these things, and trying to just go through this and also create these incredibly vivid and real worlds in a way that very few other writers do. I mean, I think Pandora is not a bad example of that either, in a very different, in our world in the late 80s. So yeah, it's this year for me has been in many ways the year of Woolf. I've read, if you count individual volumes, and if you assume I finish Earth tomorrow or whatever before the end of the year, I will have read 8 Gene Wolfe books this year, which is the most, I'm pretty certain, by a big margin of any author. I've read Tolkien 5, Farmer 3, Hobb 3. There's a few others I've read a couple of, but yes, a great writer, great works, and yeah, at some level I'm hitting some of the high notes here. New Sun, for many people, is their best favourite book, and New Sun and Long Sun are considered some of his best. But there's others that I'm planning to read next year. I'm planning to read, at least, I'm going to read Short Sun, I'm going to read Wizard and Knight, and I've got a couple other things I want to read as well. I think things like Maybe There Are Doors, or maybe start the Latro series. I've got pieces. Well, I also read some short stories by him, which were, if you actually really want to get into easy Gene Wolfe, read his short stories where there's usually one thing he's trying to do rather than a million things. But yeah, I think those are my favourite books of the year, and if there's any one of them, I think the two I enjoyed the most, let's put it that way, were Citadel of the Autarch and Nightside the Long Sun. Maybe Nightside, maybe Lake. I think I also had an enormous amount of time for Exodus, but was slightly more knotty and required just a bit more, like there was so much going on. But I think they're all very good books, and I would recommend that you read Gene Wolfe, is what I'd recommend. Anyway, those were my top 10 books or series of the year. You tell me some of yours in the comments. I'd love to hear, and any recommendations, and hopefully you pick up some of my recommendations. If you're interested in anything I've talked about, just ask more in the comments. Till next time.